This is a production of Cornell University.
Thanks for having me. I just told Greg I needed to apologize that this is a veggie-focused talk, so my appointment is all specialty crops. I plan on working in perennial fruits and small fruits as well. But I would say my thinking is a little more mature when it comes to what I might do in vegetable crops. I'm going to focus on that. Yeah. 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 So rather than kind of walk through and give you the details of what I'm thinking about doing, what I've already started, maybe what I've done in the past, I thought it might be a good approach to share with you kind of how I think about weed management problems in a more general way, and kind of dive into some concepts or some theories that really inform my thinking about weed management. And so that's my plan. And we'll see, I typically talk to extension audience, and so you don't really dive into theory when you're talking to growers, but I thought this might be a nice opportunity to do some of that with you guys. So, you would think that, there's really only one goal when it comes to weed management, and that's we want to kill as many weeds as possible. But there is some underlying theory in how we design tactics to do that. And from an ecology standpoint, we have broader goals as far as what we want to get out of our weed management programs. So we want to maintain low population equilibrium densities in our weed seed banks and our emerged populations. We want to avoid population peaks, so we want to avoid bad years where we have huge yield loss and huge weed seed rain events, especially in arable communities. And then also we want to use tactics that prevent us from seeing adaptations, so specific weeds becoming adapted to our systems or specific weed communities. And so if that's the primary goal, let's see. There we go. We have this, we kind of have this organizing framework called Weed Community Assembly. And this has been around for years. A couple scientists, Rich Smith up in New Hampshire and Dave Mortensen at Penn State, have recently put a little different spin on Weed Community Assembly by connecting kind of the ecological niche theory that underlines this framework with kind of successional ecology or a disturbance framework. And the way they conceptualize that is the way that weed communities come about, they go through a series of filters. And so, in kind of classical ecology, we think about the niche theory as a series of an abiotic filter that constrains populations due to limiting environments or disturbance or particular soil types, and biotic filters, right? So the interactions between species, top down, bottom up. But in arable systems, so in a highly managed system, there's these additional filters that we think about. So the cropping system filter and the management filter, and they're hierarchical. So the higher level filters constrain the communities that pass through, and then also kind of constrain what options we have for management at lower levels. So if we think about what the important factors are, and this is not an exhaustive list of kind of what encompasses these filters, but when I think about this hierarchical filter here, I think about the factors that contribute to the weed species pool that we have at the field level. And so that's a function of both propagule pressure, so species coming into the environment, seed bank legacies of annual weeds, and then perhaps shifting climate patterns. We see some of that already occurring as we see some new species moving north in latitude. Propagule pressure is a big one now. Typically we think that it's really the seed bank legacy that matters, but with this kind of emerging problem of herbicide-resistant weeds that are getting spread over the region, propagule pressure is an important factor. So The cropping system, so that's really what is the design of your crop rotation? How many crops you have in rotation, what are their life cycles, winter annuals, summer annuals, their growing season length, the type of fertility inputs that are particular to that system. And then really this is kind of the important one. So that when we think about kind of the management filter, this is where we kill the weeds, right? And so typically we're either using herbicides, broad spectrum herbicides, selective herbicides, or tillage and cultivation, or a combination of those tools. And these are high disturbance intensity and frequency events. And so those create the very conditions in which weeds are adapted to. So weeds become adapted to disturbance, and they also are adapted to these events which we see spikes in available resources. And so you have this filter below it, and this is really the internal dynamics. This is where the ecology happens, the crop competition, bottom up, top down level processes. And so if we're thinking about achieving those goals of preventing adapted species in our system, what we really need to do is lower the intensity of these disturbance events. So rely less on herbicides or tillage, or the combination of both, and rely more on these filters above these processes, so at the cropping system level, by diversifying crops in the rotation, the life cycles that we use, and then also increasing kind of the biotic potential control levels. So once you start tinkering with the cropping system to only achieve a weed management objective, that's where you run into issues, because once you start doing that, you start tinkering with that type of thing, you are influencing other components of the system that we care about. So that's why when we think about taking that type of diversified weed management approach, it's important to look at that in the context of kind of the entire system. And so using kind of the agroecology system framework is really important for doing that. So you know, agroecology principles are really based on just minimizing or reducing external inputs and relying more on natural processes or ecological processes to achieve both pest management objectives and soil management or fertility management objectives. So if we're changing tactics to manage weeds in order to really enhance biotic pest regulation, we may be producing trade-offs for other components of the system that we care about. So increasing soil quality, increasing the efficiency of cycling nutrients, water conservation, all those factors. And so the way I see it is, you know, thinking about designing new ways to manage weeds, diversifying weed management tactics. The response to the weeds is just one response. It's really a multivariate response surface that includes dynamics related to soils and other pests. And so these are the goals that we think about when we're thinking about adopting more agroecologically based pest and fertility management. And this is the one I think about a lot these days, and that's how do we design systems that are resilient, that have capacity to adapt to disturbance. And so we think about this a lot in terms of climate change, so systems that can adapt to changes in the climate, but also it could be to new pests, so that are resilient against new pest problems. So if that's the goal for, you know, if the goal is to design and evaluate weed management practices that accomplish those types of objectives, that's much different than traditional weed science work. And it's because, you know, we can, if we're thinking about evaluating a new herbicide or a new product, we can pretty confidently come up with what we think is the response from a weed community standpoint. This particular herbicide controls these weed species with similar functional traits. But if we're using diverse tactics, we're creating a lot of trade-offs. And I think that's the real challenge for incorporating that type of research into an extension program. And that how do you evaluate what those trade-offs are? How do you prioritize what the trade-offs are? And then how do you communicate? How do we think about those trade-offs to a grower audience? And the other thing is that the processes that play out are really just, they're context dependent because the ecology of each system is a little bit different, and it's going to produce a series of different trade-offs. So there's really a high level of context dependency, and so we don't get that predictable response that we might see with a herbicide if we're using diverse tactics. So I think that's something I think about, and I think it's we're moving into kind of a new era of extension weed science research away from herbicide-based programs, and so thinking about what a good extension program looks like around diverse weed management tactics is a challenge. Okay, so I mentioned this idea that we're thinking about building agroecosystems that are resilient, that have the adaptive capacity to disturbance, whether climate or related to pests. And I've been thinking about food system resilience lately. And so that really just broadens our thinking related to agroecosystem resilience to kind of socioeconomic processes. And so the goal of food system resilience is not just it's not about production, but also about access to foods. And so it couples the production process with distribution channels and ties that to the consumer. And it's all about if we're going to have resilient food systems, people need to have access to a diversity of products. And it really points towards redesigning our systems around kind of locally or regionally food economies. And so, if you look at the factors or the processes that are going to contribute to food system resilience, it's not just increasing diversity in our agroecosystems, but also increasing diversity of distribution networks, increase dietary diversity. So they're thinking about nutrient-dense, healthy food systems. And so the reason why I've been thinking about this is when I started off talking about the hierarchy of management filters, that cropping system filter really shapes what we have as far as available management tools for weed management. And decisions at that level are driven by economics. They're driven by, do we have a market for that particular crop? It may make sense from breaking pest cycles or increasing soil quality, but it's a non-starter if it doesn't make economic sense. And so this kind of framework presents kind of a normative case for redesigning a system that diversity is really the core focus. So that might seem fairly academic. In some respects, it may still be, but there's this really interesting book that was published by Laura Legnick a couple years ago. It was called Resilient Agriculture, and she went around the country and talked to kind of leading edge growers across all types of production systems. So field crops, vegetables, fruit production systems, and asked how they think about designing their system and in the context of resiliency in the face of a changing climate. And the way she summarized almost all the growers when they talked about resilience, they talked about resilience from kind of an agroecosystem standpoint, so introducing crop diversity. They all prioritized practices that built soil quality, but they also identified these economic components, so access to high value markets, diverse capital assets. And so I've been thinking about that. So, you know, what are the advantages and disadvantages and challenges and opportunities in New York if that is a long-term goal, to build more resilience in our food systems? And everybody knows New York is a wonderfully diverse state when it comes to the number of agricultural products that we produce. And so built into that is this infrastructure, this capital infrastructure that supports all these products. We have the distribution channels, the value chain, and it's pretty heterogeneous spatially. So up in around Geneva, it's pretty easy to go from a dairy farm to a vineyard to a vegetable crop system within just a mile or two. And so that heterogeneity perhaps presents some real opportunities. The other thing New York has going for it, of course, is it's got some comparative advantage when we think about location of the consumer. So being in the Northeast, close to the Eastern Seaboard, where we have a very large percentage of our consuming population, is another advantage. And we're thinking about this. So, you know, I'm a big fan of the work that Christian Peters did here about a decade ago, thinking about this concept of food sheds in New York. And so there's kind of some thinking along those lines, and we see that popping up in different areas as far as thinking about local aggregation, regional food networks in New York. So I just wanted to try to put a finer, provide some examples, I guess, of what that might look like. And I haven't gotten everywhere what I would like to see in New York yet, but I've seen some interesting operations, and I just wanted to point out a couple, which I think demonstrate kind of a local adaptation to what I consider kind of this resilience thinking. And so both of these examples are just down the road from the experiment station in Geneva, maybe two or 3 miles away. And so here's one example. It's the Hemdale Farms, so Dale Heminger, just outside of Geneva. And the Hemingers operate a 1,200 cow dairy. And they're very invested in technology. And so they are moving more and more of their production system to robotic milking parlors. So they have to rely less on labor. And then they also specialize in specialty crops and really cabbage. So this operation is diversified. It's a dairy and it specializes in cabbage. I didn't know of any dairy cabbage / cabbage operations before I came to New York. But that level of diversification is really important. So right now, there's tremendous flux in Northeastern dairies. Milk prices are really low, and small dairy producers are really struggling right now. And so you think about how, from an economic standpoint, diversification provides some resilience. So operations like the Hemingers are probably going to be able to ride out those periods of low milk prices. And it also, that level of diversification also makes sense because they've worked out really closing nutrient cycling loops. So manure is going back out onto fields ahead of cover crops. They're heavily invested in soil quality practices, integrating cover crops, reducing tillage. So when we think about that previous slide, what makes systems resilient, crop diversity, prioritizing soil quality, diverse capital assets. I think the Hemdale Farms is a good example of that. The other one is Rick Peterson, the Peterson Family Farms, just down the road from Dale, and he's very diversified. I'm not sure how many total acres he has, but he really specializes in fresh market vegetable production. also grows field crops. He's in close proximity to a lot of dairies in the area, so he can sell field crops locally. He's also one of the largest hop growers in New York, and he's starting to grow more and more small grains, winter grains in his rotation, malting barley, hybrid rye, those types of small grains. And his operation is about 50% certified organic, and the other 50% is non-GMO crops. So here he's diversified in the crops he grows, and then also premium markets. So he has access to these really high quality premium markets. And he, just like Dale, is very heavily invested in kind of soil building practices. So he thinks about and integrates a cover crop wherever he can in the rotation. And he doesn't do no-till, but he's very serious about reducing the intensity of tillage in his system. So he does this low-till kind of practice. So to tie those things together, so the way I'm thinking about designing a research and extension program around developing diversified weed management systems is at 2 levels. And it kind of corresponds to the community assembly framework I shared with you. So at the lower level, I'm going to be thinking about developing a diverse set of weed control tactics. So combining things like herbicides, reduced tillage, cover crops, with the goal of the overall goal of minimizing external inputs where we can, and then also making sure that the combination of those tactics still produce robust weed control outcomes, and then also thinking about all those agroecosystem trade-offs. So understanding and evaluating what those trade-offs might be related to new tactics. And then at kind of a higher level, I'm also want to work in the development of more diversified cropping system practices that kind of build on the strengths of New York and the diversity of ag that we have, as well as kind of understanding and utilizing some of the local adaptations that are already going on, like the Peterson farm or the Hemdale farm, and then thinking about both ecological and economic resilience by kind of using agroecology practices. So I thought that I would run through an example of my previous work at Penn State that kind of illustrates some of these concepts to kind of put a finer point on that. So I was at Penn State as a postdoc for 3.5 years prior to coming here, and principally my responsibilities was as a project coordinator for this long-term cropping systems experiment at Penn State. It was called the Reduced Till Organic Systems Experiment, or ROSE. And I came in to this project. It was in its 3rd year, so it had almost completed 1 3-year rotation, and then kind of helped the project transition into another funding cycle where we kind of redesigned the system a little bit. But the overarching objective of this project was thinking about how we can reduce the intensity or frequency of tillage in organic annual field crop rotation. And so when we think about these high disturbance weed control tactics, organic field crop production is a pretty classic case. So we rely on intensive inversion tillage followed by frequent cultivation events to manage weeds. And so those are the conditions where we create adapted weed species or adapted weed communities. And so the project was really about how do we diversify our tactics and move away from that high intensity, high frequency kind of weed management practices. So the way we did that was by integrating and relying more on biotic weed control measures. And so the way we did that was by growing really high biomass cover crops and rolling them down with the roller crimper and planting cash crops into the rolled, killed cover crop. And so this is just an example. We did this both in corn and in soybean. And so in front of corn, we would grow hairy vetch and triticale mixture, and we would roll that down and no-till plant field corn into it. And then in front of soybeans, we would plant cereal rye, allow cereal rye to get really big, roll that down, and plant soybeans into that rolled mulch. And so here we're moving away from intensive tillage, inversion tillage, and we're moving away from in-crop cultivation, or at least frequent in-crop cultivation, and relying on this biotic weed control measure. And then we also looked at integrating tactics. So in combination with growing high residue cover crops, we used high residue cultivation. And so high residue cultivation, it doesn't invert the soil, so it leaves the residue on top, whereas traditional cultivation would kill weeds by really mixing soil between the rows. So cultivation, high residue cultivation has these broad, flat sweeps that allow you to come in, not invert the soil, but sever roots of weeds. So we're looking at that in combination with different levels of residue. And so the way we were getting that is by delaying termination. So if we terminated earlier, we would be working with lower levels of cover crop biomass. And so you can see this is, we terminated late. We had lots of biomass here. We terminated about 3 weeks earlier in this case, lower levels of biomass. You can see we have already established the cash crop. So here's some of the results from that study. We just published some of this work in Weed Science. And so I'm just gonna be talking about the soybeans just to kind of narrow down the story. So we replicated these studies at 3 different locations in the Mid-Atlantic, Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. And on the x-axis here, you have, this would be the different termination dates. So as you move across the x-axis, you'd be getting into later termination dates where we'd have greater levels of biomass. And then the 2 shades of gray are with or without cultivation. And so, you know, we can run this through some null hypothesis testing, and we were able to separate some means. But I think just looking at the effect size averaged across years and locations is really more informative because it points to one of the challenges that I suggested at the beginning of the talk, and that we see the response of these, the response to be really location specific. So we didn't see the same trend with delaying terminations across the 3 sites. We saw each location really had its unique response to those tactics. So that's one take home. And then I think the other take home is, you know, we had a more consistent response, at least in directionality, maybe not magnitude, with the high residue cultivation in comparison to delaying termination dates. And so that's pretty typical in what we see, that we see a more robust response in using a herbicide or using a cultivator than we would see in relying on kind of a biotic control measure like cover crops. So the other thing we were interested in looking at is all the trade-offs that were associated with this. So, you know, we were delaying termination, so that was a 3-week delay between the early termination and the late termination. And we were generating different levels of cover crop biomass. And so you can imagine that this potentially creates trade-offs related to other pests. And so one of the pests that we identified as a trade-off was there was this interaction with termination date and the level of termination efficacy with the roller crimper. And so when we terminated later, we we were terminating cereal rye plants that eventually would produce mature seed. And we started dealing more and more as we followed the rotation with volunteer cover crops. And so this panel here is just the rank abundance of the wheat community in the seed banks. And you can see between the two different planting dates, as we delay termination, all of a sudden we get cereal rye popping up as the primary species, or the most abundant species in the wheat seed bank. And that produced effects in the subsequent cash crop. So when we terminated late and we sampled the winter wheat crop that followed, we saw higher levels of grain contamination. So if you're taking winter wheat as a cash grain and you take it to an elevator, you're going to get docked at the elevator for having that level of contamination. So that was one pest management trade-off. Another pest management trade-off was related to the insect community. So we were tracking both predatory arthropods and also early season insect pests. And so this is a structural equation model that I was fitting to each site and each cash crop, where we were trying to identify what the yield limiting factors were and what the interactions were between these different variables in the system. And so at Pennsylvania, when we delayed the planting date, we were increasing cover crop biomass, but we were also decreasing the number of predatory arthropods we had in the community. And you know, in an organic system, we're relying on those predatory arthropods for biological control of early season insect pests. So there's this dynamic where weed control tactics are influencing pest management of different pests. One more trade-off, and again, so and the other thing is all these things that I'm highlighting and all the structural equation models were really coming out to be very location specific, and so the dynamics that were playing out were vastly different. So this example is from the Maryland location. And so this is one of the issues that we thought we would see, but we only saw at the Maryland location, is that when you delay termination to really get more weed suppression out of your cover crops, you have more issues with consistent stand establishment. So it's just tougher to get a no-till drill through higher levels of biomass, and you run into issues of not being able to open and close the seed furrow, reduce stands. And so we actually saw that to be the case at the Maryland location, whereas cover crop biomass increased, soybean populations decreased. So again, I'm providing all these examples to really demonstrate that while diversifying weed control tactics is a really important goal, if we're going to develop and evaluate those tactics, we have to take really a multivariate approach to that research and understand what it's doing to all the components of the system.
John, does that roller machine, does it sever the grain when it's terminated, or is it just bending it down and then it kind of dies out?
So that's a good question. The question was about the roller crimper. How does it actually kill the cover crop? So it kills it in two ways. Sheer weight, and then it actually crimps the stems in multiple locations. So that chevron pattern, it's going to crimp the vascular tissue, and if the rye is standing up nice and tall, it's going to crimp it in 3 or 4 spots. But it doesn't always kill it. Yeah, it's the termination efficacy is related to the phenology of cereal rye.
And is the grain contamination related to grains that do survive this roller crimping process?
Yes. Well, yeah. So if you terminate too late, you're at a point. If you're at anthesis, and if it doesn't, you don't get a good kill. It goes. The seed matures. Yeah. Okay. So. then we transitioned into the next 3 years, and this is really, I started really managing the project at this point. And so we kind of made some adaptations based on what we learned in the first 3 years. And one of the changes we made was to try to get around the trade-offs related to having high levels of weed suppressive cover crop mulch, but also making sure that we can establish the cash crop. And so we changed the way in which we were roller crimping. We went away from the large roller crimper and went to these integrated rollers that run ahead of a no-till planter, and had these heavier duty row cleaners. And what that did was consistently opened up a wider furrow for us to get the seed furrow open and closed. And we were still using high residue cultivation. We were using it adaptively. We didn't have a no cultivation treatment. And the treatments that we did change is we actually moved, and we had this no-till soybean phase, and in a different system, we managed the soybeans as a tilled system using kind of conventional techniques. So moldboard plow ahead of the cash crop. This is out of order. We would line cultivate before the crop is up, and then inter-row cultivate several times. And so we were comparing what are the trade-offs between the no-till system and the full tillage system in this case. So here's some of the data. This is somewhat preliminary. We're done. The 3 years have been completed. Master's student Rebecca Champagne just finished up on that. And so this is total weed biomass compared to the no-till system and the tilled system in soybeans. And so you can see that we got pretty comparable levels of weed suppression. And I should note that we have different standards in organic field crops. Anything below 1,000 kilograms per hectare is pretty good. That's probably not what you're shooting for in a conventional system. In vegetables, you definitely can't handle that level of weed pressure. But where we did see some differences, which was interesting, we started collecting data, our weed data, between the row and in the row. Because we really had different, between the tilled system and the no-till system, we had different mechanisms going on. And we saw a difference. We saw a greater proportion of the total weed biomass was in the row in the tilled system compared to the no-till system. So the other thing I think is important is, again, we're not, decisions about what type of approach we're going to adopt may not be driven by weed control performance. In some respects, they may be driven by how variable these systems are from year to year. So we may prioritize a system where we see less weed control failures over a 5 or a 10-year period. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is to partition the variance out of the weed biomass to understand what factors are contributing to the variability that we see in total weed biomass. And so, so this is the tilled system between the row and in the row, and the no-till system between the row and in the row. And these are factors in a multiple regression. And this is semi-partial correlation. So you can think of it as the unique contribution to the variance for each of these factors. And so I just want to point out, a couple of things that we saw was the Seedbank legacy seemed to be more important in the tilled system, in the highly disturbed system, for both between the row and in the row than the no-till system. So that's an interesting pattern that popped out there. We saw a pretty predictable response for in-row, where the main contributor to the variability was how well we did as far as crop stand establishment, which makes sense. We had crops in the row, they were more weed suppressive, they canopied close sooner, and that's what drove variability in the tilled system. But environmental conditions, so just the year-to-year variability, is what really drove weed control performance in the no-till system, which is interesting because I think what it really is the soil conditions and how much disturbance we really did with those row cleaners that was really driving the response in weed pressure. And so if we can identify where that variability is, then we can make modifications to the system to address the variability. Okay, I better finish up. I'm going to run through this. So that was the weed control tactics. And now I'm going to have to run through the diversified cropping practices quickly. So even if we have those events, and it's often the case in organic systems where we have high weed seed rain events, we have some weed control failures, like this example with giant foxtail in this year in the beans. This is where the rotation, the cropping system comes in. So we're rotating to a winter annual cash crop, and we want to harvest a profitable crop in this case. But one of the principal factors that's going on here is it potentially, we want it to drive weed seed banks down. So we want to utilize that winter annual life cycle to drive down weed seed banks so that we can go back into a summer annual, more profitable cash crop. But we are also interested in, well, can we do that and still reduce the intensity of tillage in that phase of the rotation? So we had a system where we actually no-till planted spelt into soybean stubble, and we supplied the fertility by using manure injection, and then frost seeded with a no-till drill our cover crop into the winter grain. So we had the cover crop there when we took off the grain, and that was a defoliation event, which is a weed management tactic or a weed control tactic. And then we either took a forage cut or adaptively managed it and mowed it to eliminate weed seed production. And we had systems where with different levels of intensity as far as tillage goes. So we had a system where we had a moldboard plow ahead of the spelt, and then also ahead of the cover crop. We had a system where we reduced the intensity with the chisel plow, all the way down to this system I just described, where for 2 years we had no tillage in the system. And this is what the weed seed banks look like. So you can see in each one of the systems, in two different starts, we were driving weed seed banks down. A lot of variability, but in each case, regardless of the intensity of tillage, weed seed banks were declining, which indicates that this may be a phase of the cropping system where we can reduce intensity of tillage, frequency of tillage, and still manage weed seed banks. I'm going to skip this one just so I can wrap up. So just to bring it back to kind of my plan, I guess. And so just to summarize, and I think this is a rough plan. This is an evolving plan, but I'm really thinking about if we think about kind of the original weed community assembly, the goal is to reduce the intensity, those high intensity weed control events, and so that would be one of the goals of my research. And so that's a multi-pronged approach. It includes herbicide stewardship, so we're using the right herbicide at the right time at the right rate. There's opportunities for precision weed control using precision ag technology that's coming along. Very interested in reduced tillage practices. A news program has done a lot of great work in this area, which I hope I can work with her on. And then developing these biotic-based weed control tactics. So thinking about how we can effectively integrate cover crops into the rotation, what that means for integrating them with other weed control tactics like herbicides or cultivation. And then finally, evaluating and developing different kind of cropping system level diversification strategies. And so I went big for my first grant proposal and just submitted an OREI. I submitted an OREI with Mark Searles and Gary Bergstrom and Sarah Petherbridge and Miguel Gomez. And so that's going to look at thinking about ecological resilience and economic resilience by utilizing these high value winter annual grains that Mark has been working on in his breeding program. So the heritage grains, the ancient grains, he's been working on malting barley. All these winter grains have premium markets. They have premium secondary markets, feed grade quality grains. And so the economics potentially makes sense, and then we want to look at what are the cultural practices that kind of increase our ecological resilience in vegetable crop rotations. So I about talked through the entire time, but I'll stop there and hopefully take a question or two.
Thank you.
Should I do Geneva first?
No, why not?
All right. Is there any questions from Geneva?
No, thank you.
No? Okay. Hey.
Questions, Ithaca?
Yeah, Tom.
Did you see any shifts in the either species composition or functional type composition in your weed communities in relation to any of your control strategies?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question was about shifts in either community composition or functional traits. So that last slide. You know, we have a really good weed seed bank data for these last 3 years. And so I'm just starting to dive into the community level analysis, and the first shot at this particular analysis indicated that we weren't seeing dramatic shifts in the weed community between in that phase of the rotation along a disturbance tillage gradient. And I think that it could be for two reasons. One is there's a pretty well-established seed bank legacy at this point, and the other reason is we might not have sampled at the intensity we needed to identify a shift in weed communities. I actually think that when it comes, the weed community question is interesting from an ecological standpoint if we see a shift in the community, but what happens is you get a lot of innocuous weeds in the weed community that may be jumping out and indicate, showing a shift. Purslane speedwell, that's not a species that's going to be yield limiting. So I think what I was doing was pulling out weed species that we know to be abundant and potentially yield limiting in the corn crop in the next phase of the rotation, and looking at seed bank shifts, transition rates. So I think it's a better approach would be to look at functional traits. So mid-season, summer, annual weed species, what are they doing, rather than looking for a shift in the weed community.
So we're out of time, but anyone who has further questions or would like to dialogue with Professor Wallace, I think he'll be around for a few minutes and come to the front and speak to him. Thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.